Hi there, I'm Juliet Eilperin. I'm the Senior National Affairs Correspondent for the Washington Post, and I'm waiting till we have the director and executive producer of The River and the Wall to come join me on stage. Excellent. So, all right. Okay. So thanks so much for taking the time to come here and discuss this film that we've all been lucky enough to watch. Obviously, our timing is impeccable, given what's been happening here in Washington, that we had obviously a pretty interesting vote today in the Senate to send a motion of disapproval to the president about his national emergency declaration, but we're not here to talk politics, but really the substance of this film. So I'm going to start with you, Ben. And I was wondering if you could you obviously end talking about how this debate would bring attention to this landscape. And there are multiple times in the film where you address the issue of the prospect of a binational park and kind of broader protections across US and Mexico for this region. And I was wondering if you could talk about what obviously seems like a somewhat improbable idea, given the moment that we're in. What would be the prospects for a binational park, what's happening right now in Mexico, and how do you see this film being part of that discussion?
Thanks for coming to my movie. Yeah, this is so much fun to make, and it's an honor to be here. And you know, there's a lot of really wonderful things happening along the border, and it is kind of a shame that oftentimes when the conversations go to the US-Mexico border, there's not a lot of the positive things that are mentioned, but there's, you know, US and Mexico conservation organizations bringing back Sonoran pronghorn. They're bringing back desert bighorn sheep. There's a lot of success stories. There's been different studies looking at possible environmental flows into the Rio Grande. And, you know, I think that it is important to recognize, kind of like what Will Hurd was saying, that, you know, it's 2,000 miles long. And there's areas where, you know, there is a lot of human activity, but there's also areas where the potential of doing big landscape scale conservation efforts are very real and possible. And, you know, the film mentions the idea of the binational park, and that's been around for over 80 years. And if that actually came to fruition, it's exactly the same as what we have up on the Canadian border. It would be an area 150% the size of Yellowstone National Park and extremely much more biologically diverse because you have so much terrain change. So, yeah, I think that was one of the main purposes of the film. Is I've spent a lot of my life on the border, and the border that I see talked about in national media isn't the border that I love and that I've spent so much time on.
Thanks. And so we also have here Howard G. Buffett, one of the executive producer of the film. Could you talk a little about why you wanted this film to be made, and for someone who has invested so much time and thought on border issues, how you see it playing into the discussion we're having?
Well, the biggest problem we face when we get into this subject is there's no rational discussion. It's sound bites and it's, you know, very politicized. So I think, you know, whether you come in and sit down and watch this film from the standpoint that you believe in, you know, any part of the realm that can affect how people cross our borders, whether it's an immigration issue, whether it's a narcotics issue, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's a humanitarian issue, which the core of this problem or challenge starts in the countries of origin. It doesn't start at our border. So no matter how you look at it, I don't think you can come in and watch this film and logically walk out and say there are parts where there's absolutely no reasonable person would say we would put a barrier. I mean, nature built a barrier better than man can build it, and that's what Ben has shown. So I think the point is, I believe there's appropriate barriers in appropriate places, but there are many places that are not appropriate, and I think that's the message in the education. To me, this is an educational film. It's if you don't know what you're going to do to our country and what you're going to do to our environment and our conservation efforts, watch this film.
Can I add on to that?
Please.
So,
Who do you think you are?
I'm sitting in the middle here. So whenever we started this project, it's so hard to obtain unbiased data. Like, you go looking for data, you find whatever you want. And we went on the journey, we filmed all the wildlife, which I knew how to do, but telling the immigration component of it, the root issues, the narcotics issues, and some of the border wall and border patrol strategy, like Howard said, in a nuanced, rational discussion, that information was really difficult to find. And whenever we first met, I read his book called The 50-State Border Crisis, which like really goes into depth into a lot of the issues that the film was just barely able to scratch the surface on. And I appreciate you making that to have a guide for the movie. It made things a lot easier. Thanks.
I think you would have done fine without me, Ben. But
Well, no, it's serious. Like, there's so many different variables and factors into this entire topic. So, yeah.
Excellent, thanks. And well, I have many questions that I can ask, but I also imagine that everyone in the audience does. We have a couple of folks with microphones, so if at some point, if folks have questions and they want to raise their hands, that's fine. If not, in the meantime, I'll ask one more and you can think of your smart questions. So one thing that's actually picking up on what you just said is that you talked about how it was difficult to get unbiased information, and certainly that's a challenge that journalists face, that folks face when they're researching this. Clearly, the people, you obviously picked two of the members of Congress who have thought the most about this and have really worked to try to reach common ground. How much did you reach out to, say, proponents of the administration's proposal? Did you find an articulate visionary for the other side and choose not to include that perspective in the film? How did you evaluate how to include folks who would have argued about the damage that is being done and why this is a policy option that we should explore?
Well, in the film, Will Hurd says that in urban areas, it makes sense to have a border fence. So, that side was represented. As far as the logic of giving a voice to somebody who wants a sea to shining sea wall, that opinion, we didn't seek that out because that's just not a opinion that's worth spreading out to the public.
It isn't just the Rio Grande or parts of the Rio Grande. If you go across, there's huge expanses in New Mexico of huge open, it's barbed wire fence, and they're big open areas, for miles and miles, and it's some of the most rugged terrain on the south side and some of the most rugged terrain on the north side. So, and then you can go to Nogales and you can take 30 miles, almost 30 miles west of Nogales, and it's this incredible mountainous area that's hard to describe without seeing it. There are places there are other places where it's not just Rio Grande, where you would look and you would just say there's no logical reason why you would try to create a barrier when you already have such a significant barrier. And when the first 700 miles of fence went up, or 600, whatever it was, that was done strategically. I mean, they thought through where the high traffic areas, where the people we want, and some of it was done strategically in a way that I think if people knew all of it, would be kind of disappointed in how it was selected in terms of trying to push people into hostile areas. And so, that first sections of fence that were installed were done with high traffic areas. The next logical thing to do is you start you can put fence where there's appropriate places to put it, and there are some appropriate places to put it, and there's some very inappropriate places to put it. So when you do that, you learn where the choke points are, you learn where the high traffic is, you learn where people are gonna move to try to move either people or narcotics. So there's a logical way to go about it, and a logical way is not to say we're gonna start at one end and go to the other and we're gonna build it all the way across. It makes no sense.
Are you gonna chime in one more time, or should we see whether people out in the audience?
Does anybody have any questions?
It's gonna take us over. All right. Right down here in the front, but please wait for the microphone to come to you rapidly.
Wow, thank you. Hello. Fantastic film. Thank you so much for making that. And I enjoyed the humor throughout it too. I found it very approachable. And I'm wondering, what's your vision for getting this distributed to the people who maybe need to see it most? Those who do have the simple concept of build the wall from sea to shining sea.
Thank you. Well, we finished the movie on Wednesday. And it feels good. We've been rushing to get this thing out, and you guys laughed, and whenever y'all were supposed to laugh and stuff. So that felt good. I'm really glad not everybody fell asleep and didn't say anything, because I'd be very disappointed. But as far as what are we gonna do with this movie, on May 3rd, we are going to release it theatrically nationwide to hundreds of theaters. And at the same time, we're also gonna put it up onto many different outlets like iTunes and Google Play and Amazon Prime and a bunch of different outlets. And our goal for the film is to get it out there as fast as we can on as many different outlets as we can, just to allow the most eyeballs to see it, because that's the purpose of the film is to be seen. So May 3rd, it's gonna be public everywhere.
Excellent. All right, do we have any other?
However, we are looking for a broadcast partner. If anybody knows anybody at National Geographic.
Right over here. Amazing what you can do with the platform. Sir, did you have a question?
Great film. Drone shots were spectacular. Very high production values. I liked the narrative arc, and the music was really great, energizing, and the humor was really spot on, I thought. I'm involved in a study with a group in Virginia, and we're studying different parts of the state, rural and urban. And I know this may not seem directly related to your film, but the question that I have is, how well do we know each other? How well do we know where the other person, who's different than us, comes from? And how do we break through that lack of engagement with other people who are different than us to come about, to bring about solutions to some of these problems like immigration? The way things are going now, it's like a kind of symptom of, our overall disagreements and so on. So I was just wondering if you'd comment on, how do you get your message out? How do you speak to other people and include them in the dialogue?
I was going to be a smart aleck and say Ben has that answer, but he looked at me. So, well, I think it's a pretty deep-seated issue that you're raising. I mean, people have a very hard time relating to something they don't understand. They have a very hard time relating to someone who does things differently. So unless you've been on the ground in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, and you've seen the kind of violence and you've seen the fear that people live in, I think it's very hard for most people to understand that, in fact, this month we hit an 11-year high in terms of apprehensions of people coming across, and many of those people will claim asylum. There are people who game the system. There are people who aren't honest about what they do, but there are also thousands of people who are coming in fear. I mean, I always, people who, and we fear that. Okay, so we on the other side of it, they're coming in fear, and I think we fear that because we don't know what that means. We don't know what that means for our children. We don't know what that means for our society. We don't know what it means economically, so we fear it. So I always say to people, if I came home to my wife and said, grab a bag, no, that bag's too big, grab another one, put whatever you can put in the bag, grab the kids, and she's saying, what about our house? It's half paid for. What about our 2 vehicles? We just paid the last one off. What about the kids in the school? All their friends? What about Aunt Alice, who we've been taking care of? And it's like, nope, we gotta go. And you pick up and you leave everything you've known in your life behind, okay? To do that, we can't imagine doing that, okay? But to do that, that means you are incredibly fearful of something, okay? And when I've talked to people on the railroad tracks in Veracruz and Chiapas, and I've asked them, I've said, how do you make this journey? I mean, they've left kids at home, there's thousands of different stories. They're all different. And the answer is always that the fact that I face death is still better than what I'm leaving behind. You're gonna have a hard time stopping those people from coming to this country because we are the wealthiest country. And people are gonna migrate where they think things are gonna be better. So we have set up a set of circumstances by ignoring this problem for the last 20 or 25 years that has really put the society at odds. And it has taken people who should recognize the humanitarian aspect of it and turn their back on it. It's people who are so wanting to see people come in that they forget that 72,000 people, citizens of this country, are dying from overdoses. And I can tell you that's a low number because there's a lot of autopsies that don't get done and there's a lot of things in law enforcement that doesn't happen. So that's the best answer I can give you is, I mean, we are at a very polarizing point in this country over something that we have to solve.
And I wanted to actually follow up on that question and ask you, Ben, obviously the personal stories of Felipe and Austin are a major component of this film. And when you started on this trip, did you envision that? Was that, how did that manifest itself? Because it clearly is something that really brings part of the perspective that Howard was just talking about.
Sure. Philippe's story, his immigrant story, I knew. The night where he won the National Geographic contest, you can hear somebody in the back going, yeah, man, that was me. That was the first time I met him. So, strangely enough, our lives have just intertwined together. And, he told me about his immigrant story 3 years ago, and we've always wanted to do a project, and it was kind of an afterthought. But as we were doing that trip and we were talking about immigration, his story really came to the forefront. And then Austin's immigration story, I knew his parents were from Guatemala, but I didn't really know anything beyond that whenever we started. He just came with us because he's a friend of mine who is he's a river rat. One day he just grabbed me and said, I have something to unload off my chest. And it was that interview that we did in the canoe, where for like 2 hours he just told me about all the stuff that he had built up inside of him. And, for me as a filmmaker, I think my favorite thing about it is you get to ask questions that you don't normally get to ask in a day-to-day setting with somebody. And I got to asking these questions about, what is it like whenever your parents don't know the school system? And I realized how privileged I was growing up to never have to deal with any of that stuff. And it gave me a lot of respect for his story, and I'm very honored that they trusted me with it. And we premiered the movie a few days ago, and Austin's parents were there, and they were so proud of him, and Philippe's mom was there too, and it was just a really cool moment to see them watch the film.
Okay, well, as a journalist, a daily journalist, I'm respectful of deadlines, so I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then everyone gets to go to a party, which is not a bad consolation prize. Right over there, we have someone. I don't know where our microphone. All right, all right, we might run over if we don't get it. All right, she's.
Okay, I'll just go for it.
Oh, hold on, the microphone is within seconds. There you go.
Sorry, I'm an impatient person. So thank you so much for this project. It's incredible. I mean, I'm from rural Colorado, parts of Colorado, and they talk about this all the time, but I've never been to the border. My question is a little bit more about some of your choices as a director. It's more for Ben, I guess. During the interviews, did you find that there were some things that were said that were potentially politically incorrect, factually incorrect, or maybe just more along with your message? And if so, how did you balance the decision to cut that or include it? And if you have an example, I'd love to hear it. Because you're speaking with a lot of different people who have different ideas. You talk about, private landowners with eminent domain, people who live this story, people who study the border and the ecology around it. So how did you choose who to interview, what to keep, and what to put away? And an example. It's a loaded question, sorry.
It must be fresh in your mind if you just finished editing the film.
That's a good question, and it's difficult because with a film you are constrained to the images that you have and the sound bites that you have. Like, you can't just go reshoot stuff, and it's not like a book where you can just make stuff up or like write it down.
Now, wait a minute.
And there's so many, and a lot of it's about delivery as well. If the subject or if the character doesn't deliver it properly and they mumble, then you can't use it. And in the film, it was difficult to get all the information that we could out there. And you could see there was times where we did have to go and use text, and we did have to use graphs, and a lot of different ways to not only give a lot of information, but give it in a way where it didn't get boring and where people didn't get turned off. And then for me, politically, I'm pretty moderate. Like, I want, common sense things to occur. And I like slow change and thoughtful discussion. And I think that was one of the things that was really important for me, was to make Will look good and to make Beto look good, and to allow them to both have their voice and to use their voice and their platform and their words that didn't make other people defensive. Because once you make an audience member defensive, or they feel like they're attacked, then they're not going to listen to the other information that you want to portray. So yeah, the interviews were really, really tough. And then to try to get it down to 105 minutes on top of that, it was really hard.
The other thing is, I just have to say this, having watched Ben go through different phases of this, is it takes a lot of courage to do what he's doing. Because no matter what happens, dropping a film like this, just the title seems political, but it's really not. It shouldn't be. But dropping this into the debate and the environment and the hostility that exists today, people are going to select things out of it. They're going to misrepresent it. They're going to try to take what they want to make it either work for them or not work for their opponent. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do this in this political environment. I think it's a very important educational tool to provide to people when they're trying to understand what the border really is, at least in Texas.
we're gonna do one more. We got one here, so I think I'm gonna give my mic.
Wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the impact campaign around this, and are you working with defenders of wildlife across the street? You know, they're suing about the wall to protect some of the wildlands, and probably other groups are too.
Sure. So as far as an impact campaign go, we just finished the film on Wednesday, so we've been like rushing to get it here, and we haven't really built that out yet. We have a month and a half still until it releases, but I think we're going to build it around a lot of the positive aspects, you know, the things that we can do that are positive, try to change the narrative a little bit about the border and show some good light, because there's a lot of wonderful things that are happening down there. As far as the Defenders of Wildlife, they've released quite a bit of reporting. They've covered it really well, especially in regards to stuff in Arizona, jaguar, and ocelot. And we've been in touch with them, with Brian, and gotten, you know, some information from them that's been valuable in educating ourselves about the topic.
So the one thing I think of when you ask that question is, so our foundation, we work in 88 countries, in 44 in Africa. We've watched destruction of corridors all through the African continent and through the South American continent. And so part of what I see when I watch this film is a huge wildlife corridor and a huge people corridor. Not people crossing, but people who are able to take advantage of the incredible natural environments that we have in this country. So when I look at this film, personally, I think of not the border issues necessarily, although you can't not think about them, but I look at it and I think of, can't we learn from other mistakes that have been made around the world of how fast you lose wildlife and the biology in places when you start to choke off corridors. And really, I know it's not the theme of the film, but it is one of the most important things I think people need to try to at least recognize.
And then I just want you to all join me in thanking the people who have brought us this film, which of course include Ben and Howard, all the people who obviously worked on this film. And